hate my parents sometimes. I mean, they're normally pretty cool, but sometimes they get these stupid ideas about having me relive the crap they did as kids. Most of the time it isn't that bad, like watching some lame movie from their childhood or arranging family game night so we can stare at the game of life for hours instead of doing something actually fun. But this summer they had the genius idea of sending me off to summer camp. Why? Well, I kinda have to blame myself. My dad is a horror nerd, and he's always watching these cheesy slasher movies from the 80s that take place at summer camp. You know the ones. A bunch of teenagers are at camp, there's sex, hijinks, dick jokes, and some crazed lunatic goes about murdering people. I started watching them with my dad, mostly for the boobs. Those flicks always had a bunch of boobs in them. If I'd have known they were going to send me off to an actual summer camp, I'd have stayed up in my room browsing naked pics on my phone. Anyway, at the beginning of summer, right when I should have been hanging out with my friends and trying desperately to give my V-card away to this girl Stephanie I knew from 4th period, they dropped me off at Camp Nightmare. Yeah, the place is called Camp Nightmare. It's themed as, you guessed it, one of those cheesy 80s slasher flick camps and marketed to dorks like my dad. Vicarious living at its best. They had all their details covered. Ringer tees and trucker caps with the camp logo, themed arts and crafts, even midnight hide-and-seek where counselors dress up as maniac killers. Lame. First day was alright. A bit boring, but nothing special. No panty raids, or skinny dipping, or lighting the groundskeeper's cabin on fire. No murder, and not a single boob to be seen. So the next day I decided to see what kind of fun I could have. I'd totally forgotten to hide my weed in my bag, and none of the other campers seemed like they were the type to have anything, so I decided I'd sneak into the kitchen and see if there was any beer or liquor hidden away. The camp cook, Lloyd, was a jaundiced ogre with a perennially stained apron. If anyone had a stash of rot gut whiskey, it was him. I snuck away from the archery range and crept behind the cafeteria, where the entrance to the kitchen was. I carefully cracked open the door to find Chef Lloyd haphazardly throwing ingredients into what I'm assuming was a stew of some sort. It was the peak of his culinary ability. After tossing in some roughly chopped mystery meat, some tomatoes, and carrots, Lloyd began opening jars and emptying the contents into the steaming pot. He briefly disappeared into a pantry area, and I took the opportunity to slip into the kitchen and hide behind a stack of burlap potato bags. Soon enough, Lloyd returned from the pantry with both a half-empty bottle of cheap booze and a gallon-sized jar of, well, I don't know really exactly what it was, since the entire thing was covered in a thick layer of dust. Lloyd wiped away some of the dirt and squinted at the label. Best if used by, when? The Carter administration. Whatever, don't tell me what to do. With that, he opened the jar, wincing at the pungent odor, and dumped a chunky, brownish-green slop into the pot. Great, I thought. I'm going to have to starve myself until camp is over. No way I'm eating anything that comes out of here. Lloyd gave the concoction a stir, then sat in the folding chair next to the stove and turned his attention to his whiskey bottle. My heart sank with each gulp he took, but I figured there was more hidden away in the pantry. I only needed him to get off his drunken, slovenly ass and leave so I could find it and swipe a bottle. It was a long, boring siege. Half a quart and half an hour in, he showed no signs of budging from his chair, despite the room becoming heavy and thick with the smell of his atrocious mystery stew. He didn't seem to mind the bowel-churning odor at all. He just sat and drank, grumbling to himself about us damned kids, and gave a very explicit commentary for the swimsuit competition turned orgy the female counselors were having in his mind. I, too, was committed to my post. I'd waited this long, and I wasn't about to abort the mission. It was booze or bust. Luck was in my favor, though, and after a few more minutes, Lloyd nodded off into a half-drunk slumber. To be safe, I waited a bit longer, the only sounds in the kitchen being the labored wheeze of Lloyd's breathing and its sickly staccato glop, glop the stew made as it boiled, sending more rancid, sweaty sock smell into the air with each popping bubble. Once I was sure Lloyd wasn't coming back from dreamland, I slowly came out from my hiding spot and carefully began to tiptoe towards the pantry. As I crept, the sticky sound of bubbles popping in the stew became more frequent, and then they turned into what sounded like burps and growls. I'd been cautiously glancing back and forth between my path to the pantry and Lloyd's snoring face, but the change in the sound drew my attention to the big pot of slop. The burping and growling grew louder as the culinary nightmare began to boil over. As the purplish-green muck crested at the edge of the pot, what looked like a 3-fingered mutant hand complete with bits of sliced carrot as fingernails formed from the ooze and reached towards Lloyd's head. All of a sudden, catching a buzz seemed much less important. Slowly, but with much less caution, I began to back away from the living stew as it made its first contact with Lloyd's face. The searing heat immediately awoke him. His eyes shot wide open and he screamed, "What the fuck?" Lloyd's scream was cut short and turned into a wet gurgle by the slop hand forcing itself into his mouth and down his throat. His yellowed eyes bulged as he widely grasped at the slimy, dripping appendage. Just as my ass bumped into the door, a crackling hiss, like the sound of a cooking bacon, came from Lloyd's head as yellow smoke leaked from his ears and nose. Blood seeped from his eye sockets and poured down his face to mix with his tears and the frothy saliva around his awkwardly stretched mouth. I was frozen in my tracks. The sight before me was too fantastical to turn away from, despite the voice screaming from the back of my head to get the fuck out of there. The end of the arm thing that had remained in the pot flopped out, and like a tail made of year-old chunky Campbell's, wrapped itself around Lloyd's neck. His body went limp as the last molecules of oxygen in his brain depleted, and with a loud schlop, blood and gray matter gushed from his ear canals. His skin began to turn the same purplish green as the mutant stew, and green blisters raised in patches. Lloyd's eyes bugged out further and took on an alien glow. Suddenly he lurched upright in the chair, then stood fully. "Oh, fuck!" I yelped before my better judgment could step in the way of my fear. The Lloyd thing turned towards me, and his right hand burst into globs of viscera. The 3-fingered soup hand had emerged from the bloody stump of his wrist, then his arm raised to point a carrot-slice-tipped finger at me. That was all I needed to get my ass back into gear. I reached behind me to find the doorknob and escaped the kitchen as quickly as I could. I ran screaming towards the first group of campers I saw, a group of 3rd and 4th grade kids the camp referred to as Chucky's chums. Why their parents thought a horror camp was a good idea, I have no clue, but none of them seemed to give a rat's ass about making macaroni art in the shape of a hockey mask. Their assigned counselor, a gorgeous tattooed co-ed named Kelly Rose, was doing her best to feign enthusiasm for the ridiculous crafting activity. "Run! Lloyd! Soup! Monster!" I panted between gasps of air. Not a single child nor Kelly understood a thing I'd said. Even if they had, they probably would have assumed it was some quirky, fun-filled camp activity. Man, fuck this place so hard. The entire group laughed hysterically, and Counselor Kelly stepped forward to investigate. Before she could get a word out, the cafeteria door slammed open and off its hinges, and the Lloyd monster stepped out into the sun. Kelly screeched in terror and turned to run. In her haste to abandon the troop of elementary kids, she'd forgotten that they all had congregated behind her. Immediately tripping over a child, she landed face down in the dirt. The children screamed and most began to cry as they chaotically ran in all directions. The Lloyd thing moved surprisingly fast for its size, and was in the midst of the group within seconds. It gurgle-screamed and flung the mutant soup hand forward like a whip. It first found purchase on the head of a curly, red-haired boy and exploded bone and brain through the child's face. Quickly retracting before striking again, the soup tentacle next shot in one ear and out the other of a hyperventilating little girl. Her crying paused for an awkward moment before the mutant Lloyd retracted the appendage and ripped her entire brain through the side of her head. It then continued to decapitate child after child. This never happened in the movies that my dad watched. Little kids were never annihilated en masse with this kind of reckless abandon. The Lloyd thing seemed to revel in it, and I, knowing better than to play hero this early in the script, took the opportunity to flee the minefield of headless child corpses. While I made my escape, the female counselor pushed herself off the ground and screamed in horror as she surveyed the carnage around her. The mutant stew hand found her, but instead of punching through her face, it grasped the neck of her ringer tee and tore it away. Her magnificent, ink-covered breasts, gilded by a sheen of sweat, jiggled ever so slightly in the afternoon sun before the monster hand hammer-fisted the top of her head. The sudden impact collapsed her entire cranium into her chest cavity, and her nipples gushed forth high-pressure streams of blood and fatty tissue. I kept running as the muck monster found a group of junior-high-aged campers at the archery range. The Lloyd creature commenced to dismembering child after child, flinging arms and legs towards the archery targets. Several of the adolescents turned their weapons on the monster. The arrows didn't seem to do much harm, and I continued running to the first building I saw. Tripping my way up the worn wooden steps to the counselor cabin, I pounded frantically on the door. The door opened, releasing thick billows of pot smoke and the main riff of Led Zeppelin's Kashmir out into the summer air. Counselor J.B. stepped out stoically and surveyed the carnage. I remembered from the orientation meeting the previous day that J.B. had taken the camp counselor job as a getaway from the Bible college he was attending. With his trucker hat perched at a tilt atop his head, mala hanging around his neck, and cut-off denim shorts, he looked less full-time clergy and more fair trade coffee. J.B. calmly cleaned the glass of his prescription lenses with the hem of his shirt and placed the eyeglasses back on his face before saying, more to himself than to me,
"It's my time to shine."
He walked briskly down the steps and towards the rampaging Lloyd monster.
"Peter, put down your sword! He who lives by the sword shall surely die by it!"
He yelled to the beast. What the hell is he talking about, I thought. But it seemed to get the stew creature's attention, so I let it go.
"If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now."
The Soup Lloyd charged towards J.B., pushing a final unlucky kid aside and sending him flying through the air to end impaled on a signpost.
"But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son!"
The mutated cook gurgle shrieked, its left shoulder exploding into a mess of purple-green ooze and coagulated blood. The left arm fell onto the ground and emitted a yellowish smoke from the blisters that burst on impact. The one-armed freak continued towards J.B. with a newfound rage. J.B. stood his ground, rolling the beads of his mala contemplatively.
"Oh, we sweep with threshing oar. Only our goal will be the western shore!"
The right kneecap of the monster burst. The same ooze and blood mixture poured from the wound. Slowed but not defeated, the Lloyd thing continued on, crawling awkwardly and leaving a messy trail of mutant fluids. I was enthralled. Just moments ago, this stew mutant had effortlessly laid waste to enough children to make the gym sock tucked under my mattress jealous, but now it wasn't even a threat. I stepped up to JB, emboldened by his confidence. Unwavering, JB continued.
"Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at Moses' feet. And she said, 'Surely you are a husband of blood to me!'"
With a loud, wet sound accented by the distinct crack of snapping bones, the prostrate stew monster's torso erupted into a mess of intestines, ribs, sections of spinal cord, and the strange mutant blood. The three-fingered hand continued to drag Lloyd's head and shoulders across the dirt towards JB.
"Tangerine, Tangerine, living reflection of a dream. I was her love, she was my queen, and now 1,000 years in between!"
Lloyd's head caved in. Gray matter and purple-green mutant blood forced through his ears and nose. The three-fingered sentient hand soldiered on much more slowly. As the purple, blistered-covered hand inched closer to his feet, JB calmly pulled a pack of cigarettes from his shorts pocket and removed one. After perching it between his lips and returning to the pack, he lit the smoke. He took a deep drag, looking down at the defeated stew monster hand as he exhaled to bitter smoke.
"Jesus wept."
With those final words, he stomped the disgusting hand, sending purple-green blood and carrot slices in all directions. He took another drag of his cigarette and looked out at all the headless corpses and dismembered teenagers before turning to me.
You want to get stoned and watch Godzilla movies?"
I mean, fuck yeah.
"Kumbaya, my friend. Kumbaya."
As I followed JB back into the counselor's cabin, I thought, maybe camp won't be so bad after all. Kumbaya. Fucking kumbaya.